now hand you over to Katrina Crowe, who's the fantastic curator of the first Thought Talk. So thank you very much.
You're all very, very welcome on this beautiful afternoon to come in and listen to two extremely erudite gentlemen when you could be swimming in the sea. But in fact, you're better served by what you're going to hear. Many of you will remember the decade of centenaries, which seems 100 years ago now. But, you know, it passed more quickly than we would have thought. The two gentlemen you see before you here came to Galway year after year during that decade to elucidate that extraordinary period for us, 100 years before what we call the revolutionary decade, looking at the complicated narratives, at the issues, at the events and the personalities that prevailed during that time. And by and large, I think overall, they, of course, were exemplary in the way that they looked at all of this. But by and large, as a country, I think we came out of that exercise pretty well, that we came out with new archives, a better understanding, a more complicated and nuanced version of our history than we had before. So we're doing another anniversary thing today. 100 years ago, the Boundary Commission, believed by many to be the solution to partition, produced its report recommending very little change to the already established border between Northern Ireland and the Free State. We've been living with the consequences ever since. Professor Diarmaid Ferriter of UCD and Professor Gearoid O'Tuathaigh of the University of Galway will enlighten us on this extraordinary commission of inquiry, as it were, the results of its operations and its deliberations, the results of the report coming out, and the fateful decision that still to this day has effects on how we think about this island that we live on. The two of them are a classic and wonderful template of the transmission and exchange of historical knowledge between generations, and we are absolutely delighted to welcome them both back to First Thought Thoughts. Thank you.
Good to you. Good morning, Katrina. Good afternoon, everybody. For generations of historians, one of the first pieces of advice that is given to them when they're starting out is not to read history backwards, or indeed, above all else, to avoid any contact with historical inevitability. Now that, I think, is advice that we all got and that we all try to keep. But there are very few episodes in modern Irish history upon which the consensus view among historians is so unshakable, so absolutely invincible as that pertaining to the Boundary Commission. The verdict is that it was a failure. The verdict is that not only was it a failure, but the manner of its failure was a shambles. And worse than both of those, that it was doomed to failure from the very start. So Diarmaid and myself are going to have a conversation for a while now to try and see if we can make some shape at restoring to the past at least some sense of the uncertain outlook that it held for contemporaries. I suppose we could start, Diarmaid, with where did the idea come from, and the idea of the Boundary Commission, and in addition to that, to what particular political problem was it proposed as a solution?
I think it's helpful to think of the two origin narratives for the Boundary Commission. There's the much broader sweep of Ulster history about it as a distinct place and a different place. And I'm not going to start getting into the Ulster plantations of the 17th century and a massive project of social engineering and, you know, taking the land, 5,500 square miles of land or square meters of land and so on. But that idea of Ulster as a distinct and different province within Ireland begins to take on an added political significance in the late 19th century when the threat of Home Rule becomes more manifest. And in particular, the first Home Rule Bill of 1886 obviously galvanises a degree of unionist opposition, though many of that generation of unionists would have considered themselves to be Irish unionists. And that leads on to, I suppose, the second part of your question is when it becomes more of an Ulster unionist issue. And that really is about the third Home Rule crisis, because the third Home Rule bill is much more likely to come into effect. And the opposition from unionists to that third Home Rule bill becomes much more concentrated on what they feel they can defend successfully. And if necessary, they are prepared to go to war in order to defend that. And it creates a huge conundrum for them, for nationalists, and of course for the British government, about how they might deal with this intense opposition to Home Rule, and Ireland really on the brink of civil war. The First World War intervenes with the issue unresolved. And of course the First World War, as with so many other things, changes dramatically the contours of the question. But it remains unresolved. So the idea of partitioning Ireland predated the First World War. And there were two, I suppose, inevitabilities, as some of the politicians of that generation saw when they were looking at Ireland, the British politicians, that Home Rule was inevitable and that a form of partition was inevitable. And we mentioned before Thomas Agar Robarts, for example, who was a Liberal Unionist MP who suggested the exclusion of 4 Ulster counties, Armagh, Antrim, Down and Derry, and that you could have a 4-county solution, if you like. And another MP we mentioned who was contributing to this debate in 1912, he asked that pertinent question: how are you in this democratic country, in this democratic age, to force 1 million people into a system they don't want to be part of? And the British government had to begin looking at how they would engage with both nationalists and unionists in relation to that. And that goes on after the First World War, where the British government, particularly with Walter Long, who was a former leader, parliamentary leader of the Unionist Party, who is now ensconced in London, in charge of a committee that is devising what becomes the Government of Ireland Act. And there were various others involved. I often think we focus so much on those who were out front that we forget what was going on in the background. And this is going on in 1919. They're trying to devise this idea of 2 separate parliaments that will be assisted ultimately by a Council of Ireland, so that Ireland can work out its own salvation. It's important to stress that it was not the preference of British politicians of that era to have a divided Ireland long term, but they had to respond to the urgency of Ulster Unionist opposition. And it was suggested in 1919, according to Worthington Evans, Laming Worthington Evans, who was Minister for Pensions at that time, but is also again involved in this wider debate about the evolution of the empire post First World War. And he suggested that James Craig, as a unionist, as a Northern Ireland, or what becomes, of course, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, somebody who was in the wings waiting to take over from Carson, that he suggested that a boundary commission might ultimately look at the question on both sides of the border about settling that boundary. They ultimately opt for 6 counties with the new Northern Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act. But there is a suggestion that there needs to be further inquiries in relation to settling the border long term, because obviously there are those who feel very strongly, for obvious reasons, they are on the wrong side of the border and would see themselves as very committed nationalists. So it is mentioned there, and it's then, of course, resurrected in a very serious way during the
treaty
negotiation of the Irish Treaty.
But there's probably the backstory, as it were, and the immediate thing. But if we look, then the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, it was not preceded by any systematic sampling, for example. The horse trading, which ended up with 6, you mentioned 4. The other was the historic province of Ulster was 9. How did they arrive at it? But it was a border that was not, if you like, mapped out according to any kind of demographics, any kind of plebiscitary consent or anything. Now, what happens, I suppose, what's interesting is when eventually it arrives, and we'll come to that in a minute, in the aftermath of the First World War, with all of the plebiscites and the boundary settlements that were taking place at the Versailles and in Europe with the successor states. The Irish situation is different for this reason, that virtually all of the plebiscites and the settlement of boundaries and the attempt to draw lines with ethnic people, right, whether they got it right or wrong, all of that was to precede the creation of states. In other words, the wishes of the inhabitants or whatever were sampled, however incorrectly. In the case of Ireland, by the time a boundary commission was established, included in the treaty negotiations, or in the treaty formula eventually, there was already a boundary. In other words, it was not to actually delineate, but to revisit something that was already there. And not only that, but to revisit it in a state which was one of the winners of the First World War, not like the dismembered empires.
That's it.
That were doing so totally different
The same
circumstances.
fracturing isn't there in relation to total war and what it did to boundaries and what it did to disputes about ethnicity and about who belongs where. And it is a big feature of the post-war discussions. Silesia was often...
the upper side, yes, that's right,
You know, I mean, disputes about the boundaries between Germany and Poland and indeed Denmark, and you even have Hungary and Romania. There are all of these they're very visceral questions for those who are involved. But there's detail about how you might measure the wishes of the inhabitants. Economic and geographic conditions are mentioned as well. This isn't just about people's political affiliations or their ethnicities. But Ireland is different in that sense. It's not part of that culture, for example, of total defeat after the First World War. And, you know, those decisions that have been made about the Government of Ireland Act, you know, it's a parallel stream. And it doesn't cross over into that.
Now, it's given to the treaty in the treaty negotiations as a way of solving the Ulster question.
Well, I wonder sometimes if the Irish delegation that were negotiating the treaty had actually fully worked out their Ulster policy. There's a sense that they go over without that resolved. Now, this leaves them vulnerable, and there is an issue around the middle of October, very early on in the treaty negotiations, which last from early October to, of course, famously early December. It comes up, the question of Ulster, and some will be familiar with the idea of the Irish negotiators wanting, if the talks are to break on Ulster, because they felt it was an issue around which they could rally support for themselves. Britain, reluctant for the talks to break down on Ulster. Lloyd George, of course, famously says, "Who wants to die for Fermanagh and Tyrone?" And, you know, they feel they have a weak case, and David Lloyd George uses that description, a weak case. Again, coming back to this idea that they don't want to see a dismembered Ireland. You know, that's not good for their wider post-war project. And of course, it also leaves trouble on their doorstep. It does. And the idea of a possible civil war on our doorstep. David Lloyd George is very conscious of that. And the idea of the Boundary Commission is really resurrected. If it was a factor in thinking in 1919 around the evolution of the Government of Ireland
device now.
It's resurrected, much to James Craig's discomfort, of course. And the suggestion is in the middle of October, and we have to be careful of the language that is being used, because it becomes very important. Arthur Griffith obviously is in correspondence with Eamon de Valera at home. De Valera famously doesn't go to the negotiations. And what he suggested was that David Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, is looking at the option of a boundary commission to present to James Craig in a tactical manoeuvre. And the way Arthur Griffith puts it is that if he's going to do this, use this as a strategy, we are not going to queer his position. That's the phrase that he uses. In other words, this could be a useful tactic for us as well. We'll try and call his bluff. And their understanding, the Irish delegation's understanding of a boundary commission, was that it would be an existential threat to James Craig and his new Northern Ireland, which he wants to make impregnable.
Yes.
And that they're going to kind of play on that vulnerability as they see it. Now, David Lloyd George, you know, James Craig even told Eamon de Valera, never meet Lloyd George on your own, because he'll always give different versions of what transpired, depending on who he's talking to. So, you know, there's a distrust there. But the impression that is being created, and we're often reliant on the diaries of Tom Jones. Because we get a ringside seat on the treaty negotiations. Tom Jones was a secretary to Cabinet, and he kept these very, very detailed diaries, which were first published in the late 60s. Now, they're not gospel, but they give a marvellous sense of the dramas and the personalities, and sometimes the fault lines that are being worked on. So the idea, as Arthur Griffith would have seen it there, is that if David Lloyd George is going to suggest this, he's not going to stand in his way. And their understanding is that this would be a commission that would ultimately involve plebiscites.
But
there would be an opportunity for people to vote.
Could we just, it might be helpful just to get the actual wording, because this was what caused all a lot of hand-wringing and so on later. The actual wording of it was that in the event of Northern Ireland opting out of the Free State, which they were entitled to do within a year of the treaty being signed, and it was assumed that they would, a commission will be appointed, consisting of 3 persons. One to be appointed by the government of the Irish Free State, one to be appointed by the government of Northern Ireland, and one who shall be chairman to be appointed by the British government, shall determine, not recommend, they shall determine, in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions, the boundaries between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. And then it goes on to say, and that in accordance with the Government of Ireland Act, that determination will constitute the boundary of Northern Ireland. Now, because there was so much hoopla afterwards about what was implicit in it and who understood it differently, you have to read that, you know, both now and then. You have to read it with the eyes of now and the eyes of then. First of all, as you rightly say, there are no arrangements or no detail here. It doesn't mention plebiscite. That's number one. It doesn't mention the units that will effectively be taken into account. Are they counties, whole counties? Are they district electoral district? What are the units that are to be done? And it also then completely puts this large chain on the wishes of the inhabitants by saying insofar as they may be compatible with economic and geographical conditions. There was a lot of bleating afterwards on the Irish nationalist side, both Northern nationalists and indeed in the Irish Free State, that there were a whole series of things in this that they understood. They strongly said that there was no question, for example, of territory going in both directions, that this clause only related to what Northern Ireland would ultimately lose, essentially. And the more optimistic and outrageous expectations were that it would squeeze Northern Ireland to the point at which it would not become viable. Reading it now, and I would have to say reading it then, if you were reading it closely in any case, you would have to say there was no justification for those outlandish expectations.
There's an extraordinary over-reading of it.
Yeah.
But we also have to compare what you've just read out with what was being proposed in October, as the delegation understood, because the caveat or the proviso that was added in accordance
with economic and social,
economic and geographic conditions, that wasn't in the original document that we have, that was signed by Tom Jones. Which was supposed to be the understanding that David Lloyd George and Arthur Griffith had agreed to.
But nobody raised an objection to that later one.
No, but there was also a suggestion at an earlier stage that this would involve both inclusion and exclusion. So that is all swirling around. And what Arthur Griffith says at one point is that, well, we wanted plebiscites, but a boundary commission is much the same thing. It certainly wasn't.
No.
So there's a real ambiguity there, which is deliberate, you would have to argue. Would it have got over the line, or would it have been accepted if it didn't hold that degree of ambiguity? But it's also the way, I suppose, that David Lloyd George, to a certain extent, ambushes Arthur Griffith by brandishing this document it became a November document, actually, when it was drafted by Jones, by saying, you had agreed to this, you know, and you can't renege on this now. And in a sense, you know, Griffith felt duty-bound. But there is clearly so much ambiguity in that. And one of the interesting things at a later stage, when Hugh Kennedy is the Attorney General of the new Free State, and they're looking at the wording, and he said, we can't now start claiming that this is ambiguous when we have been insisting that it is absolutely clear. And the clarity of the message was that, as you say, this would involve us gaining territory. And Tom Jones, again, going back to Tom Jones' diary, the impression was created that this could result in excisions that would result in Northern Ireland simply not being viable as a unit. That was very naive as well.
If we could, before we move on to the actual constitution of how it was constituted and when, essentially the immediate reaction, whether this was, calmly an appraisal or whether it was simply outrageous optimism, the immediate reaction once it was adopted in the treaty was that this was the prelude to substantial territorial transfers to the Irish Free State.
Yeah.
That was the nationalist consensus, some more enthusiastic than others, some more sceptical than others. The immediate reaction to Craig and these was outrage. We're in the state in danger, and so on. We better get ourselves together to prevent anything being lost. And the immediate story in Britain was essentially an internal political convulsion where Lloyd George was on his way out. The 1922 committee wanted the Conservatives back in, and there was such jockeying for position that this was kicking the can down the road. That's what was done for the moment. Now, what was said happened. That is to say, within a year of the treaty being signed, Northern Ireland opted out of the Free State, triggering the clause that would establish the Boundary Commission. The Boundary Commission wasn't constituted until 2 years later. Explain the delay.
One of the main reasons is that James Craig and his government of Unionists in Northern Ireland want absolutely nothing to do with it. And he's very explicit about that when he's speaking to the Northern Ireland Parliament. He says, we'll have no more talk of a commission. We are not getting involved. We are not going to nominate a commissioner. Now, sometimes James Craig's position was a bit more nuanced than his backbenchers. And there has been a suggestion from historians, including people like Alvin Jackson, who looked very closely at the internal machinations of the Unionist Party, that he was actually prepared to tolerate a commission with perhaps the involvement of Edward Carson, the former leader, on the understanding that there would only be really minor modifications, and they might actually work to the advantage of Northern Ireland. But his backbenchers were having none of that. So the formal position is that we are not getting involved. Then the British government has to start thinking, will it be invalid if we constitute this commission without a representative of Northern Ireland? They were getting advice from the Privy Council, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, and ultimately they introduce amending legislation so that they can actually appoint a representative for Northern Ireland. But that's one of the reasons for the delay. The other reason for the delay is civil war. And I mean, there is a North-Eastern Boundary Bureau established by the Southern government in October 1922. Kevin O'Shiel.
And a very good team.
A very good team, the impressive researchers and serious minds. And I mean, Kevin O'Shiel was an Omagh-born barrister. He was assistant legal advisor to the government. He took his job very seriously. There's 56 boxes of archival material for the North-Eastern Boundary Bureau. And of course, they were going off doing research in the League of Nations archives and looking at other boundary disputes, as well as, telling the story of Ulster. And there were some eyebrows raised that by page 10 of the report of the Boundary Bureau, they still hadn't reached the Ulster plantation. So they were taking their time to get to the point. But it was taken seriously, that's the point. But of course, civil war is an existential threat for that Free State, and it's not until the summer of 1923
that they nominate.
That they decide that they're going to nominate, that they're going to activate this. And they want a response from the British government. And again, there have been serious changes in British politics. We're the first Labour government. And this is quite a development. Ramsay MacDonald is Prime Minister, but he's Prime Minister of a minority government. And they don't want to reopen the whole Irish question. D.G. Boyce, the historian, has been quite cutting about the idea that the Labour Party had any Irish past to live up to or to live down to.
They didn't.
But in fairness to them, they did have a consistent history of supporting self-determination for Ireland and being opposed to it.
But neither MacDonald nor Thomas had any sympathy, whatever.
Not at all. And the way they put it, J.H. Thomas was the colonial secretary under that Labour government. And the way he put it in corresponding with Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister is that the Anglo-Irish Treaty will be our sheet anchor in all our dealings with Ireland. So they're not going to experiment. And the way Tom Jones, again, is on the scene as well. He's been dispatched over to Dublin to see could they actually try and solve this without constituting a commission. And the way he puts it is, I'm very reluctant to set my foot in the Irish bog again. He wasn't the first British civil servant or politician to talk about the reluctance to be sucked back into the Irish bog. So they are trying to avoid, obviously, it becoming what Austin Chamberlain famously said in 1924, a fatal influence on British politics again. And there's a generation of politicians in Britain who have been burnt by that. But there's also a generation of people in the colonial office, some of them more traditional-minded about empire, others would have been seen as reformers. See, we're actually going to have to deal with this as an evolution of the Commonwealth issue as well in relation to Ireland's position within it. So there are all these things going on, and the policy, according to Kevin O'Shiel, in relation to the North during and immediately after the Civil War was what he called a policy of do-nothingness, peaceful do-nothingness. Collins is dead, Arthur Griffith is dead, That is not irrelevant. You know, many regarded
for Collins, certainly, Collins particularly.
And Collins, of course, was haranguing Winston Churchill during the Civil War period about the extent of the pogroms in the new Northern Ireland. Of course, there were 500 people killed between 1920 and 1922 in that part of the island alone. So there are deadly feuds there and violence. And of course, you also have you know, the loss of Arthur Griffith and a sense that those who survive to guide this Free State can, on the one hand, take the aggression out of a policy towards Northern Ireland, because of course Michael Collins has been speaking out of both sides of his mouth when he was authorising IRA incursions into Northern Ireland, which have been very unsuccessful. But there's a sense that they can begin to pull back somewhat. People like Ernest Blythe are quite influential in relation to that. So all of those things are going on. But that Free State government also needs a win. And could the possibility of a win with the Boundary Commission be there?
Well, they nominate in July of 1923, when the Civil War comes to an end. In other words, Civil Wars come to an end, they're in a position to nominate a commissioner. But there's two others required. There's the chairperson, who was to be nominated by the British government, and then there's the thorny issue of if Craig and the Northern Ireland government refuse point blank to nominate one, does it invalidate the commission, or can anybody do it on their behalf? Now, there's an interesting kind of period here when all of this is going on, because once the Civil War is over, and indeed even before it's over, the government in Dublin, the GIAF, the Irish Free State government, they're totally occupied in actually establishing the new state. You know, you're not. They go through the motions of appointing a commissioner, but there's no way you get the sense that this is a major urgent priority.
They have a huge army crisis.
They have that, but they've also a whole series of other things. They have a land act coming up. They have an infrastructure of this, that, and the other. Craig, on the other hand, the general verdict is that the period between 1922, when they opted out as well, or indeed even since 1920, and when eventually the commission was established and sat down, the three commissioners in the end, in October of 1924. But that period is a period in which, to use that awful phrase, Craig and his government were making sure that they controlled the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground were the B specials, the reconstitution of the RUC, the change in local government, the abolition of PR, the reconfiguration of every single artery of power, so that the realities were that what had been earlier a very divided thing in Fermanagh and Tyrone, all of a sudden, virtually all of the key areas were controlled by unionists, by hook or by crook. So that the facts on the ground, as it were, are what Craig is concerned with, while doing no cooperation. The three commissioners, when they were established eventually, and it might be one of the sense of urgency that I was struck by was that when the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council was to be asked its advice as to whether or not the British government could nominate somebody for Northern Ireland, one of the members of the Judicial Committee had to be brought from Australia by boat. Now, that's a sense of the urgency with which this issue was to be resolved by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. But leaving that aside, they eventually get around to nominating Judge Feetham, who is a judge in the Superior Court of South Africa, but essentially Anglo-Welsh born, Monmouth chair, an Oxford man, a member of Milner's Kindergarten, a colonial administrator.
He was described, you know, by a senior member of the Colonial Office as constitutionally conservative in temperament.
Yes.
And it's significant that he's a judge. He's not a politician.
No.
There was a suggestion that there could be a politician to chair this, which raises another intriguing what if, you know, about a political as opposed to a judicial.
Yeah, he was the second choice, of course.
Yeah. Yes. Robert Barden, the Prime Minister of Canada, who wouldn't take it up on the grounds that Craig didn't want anything to do
with it. And
so, you know, that's who he is. You've J.R. Fisher then, who's the representative of the Northern Ireland.
Who's a straightforward unionist, former editor of the Liberal.
There's no doubting his affiliation.
Now, what about the Free State nominee? Will you say something about Owen McNeill?
I will, and I'll try and be kind. Do. You know, because there are times when I feel sorry for Owen MacNeill, because when I look at his career in the round as a politician, whatever about him as a scholar, which he was delighted to get back to after all of this was over, he always seemed to be doing someone else's bidding. And the way he put it was, nobody else could be found to act instead of me. Now, isn't that in itself revealing about so much? And he's there reluctantly. He engages, it seems, in a very reluctant way. There's a reticence there. Joe Lee described him as mixing integrity with incompetence, which is probably a verdict that has withstood the test of time. And Owen MacNeill, why would he have been chosen? Was it because he was an Ulsterman? Was it because he was a Catholic? Was it because he was deemed to be a safe pair of hands? Why wasn't it someone else?
Why wasn't it his brother? Why wasn't it his brother? James MacNeill, who actually was a very competent negotiator.
Yeah. There are all these other possibilities. And some of the correspondence, and the most frank correspondence during that era, comes from Kevin O'Higgins. Kevin O'Higgins was thinking about this boundary commission in a very different way. And I've often wondered, because it was suggested by Patrick Hogan, who was the Minister for Agriculture in that Free State government, that Kevin O'Higgins should do it. Kevin O'Higgins doesn't want to do it. And again, you know, Kevin O'Higgins has other things to do. But Kevin O'Higgins wrote something very revealing in relation to the article, in question, Article 12 of the treaty. He said, you know, we need to look for a straight deal on the proviso to Article 12, in other words, economic and geographic wish of the inhabitants. If we don't, we will have been exposed as having been very foolish. Sorry, the British government will be exposed as having been very foolish, but not nearly as foolish as us. So he was very aware of the problems around that in a way perhaps that MacNeill didn't seem to be. Now, the problem with assessing MacNeill in relation to the Boundary Commission is that he left very little behind in terms of correspondence. There's a document in 1927 in his papers that sums up the problem with the episode as the defective wording of Article 12. Okay, that's one thing. But there's the other thing is the agreements that they had when they did first meet as commissioners towards the end of 1924, that they would keep their proceedings secret.
Confidential,
Confidential. And, you know, obviously Owen MacNeill took that very seriously. Wasn't communicating with his government in a way that, you know, Fisher was
reporting all
over the place, you know. And then Feedham, obviously, it takes the whole business of the procedures and the caution and the secrecy very seriously. So, I mean, Owen MacNeill, there's a general consensus that he was the wrong choice.
Oh, he was.
You know.
But to move forward, because we want to come to why it failed, or more particularly its abandonment, going about its business once it was constituted in November. It had its first meeting in November, 6th of November, and then effectively this was when they decided the confidentiality clause. They had a large amount of documentation provided to them, submissions. They collected information between March and July of 1925.
They had Francis Bordillon, who was the Secretary of the Commission, who was an expert.
They had a statistician, and they extrapolated stuff from the 1911 consensus. But what was clear, and this is the part of it that where MacNeill perhaps stands most indicted, is that on numerous occasions throughout that period, and the Commission was only in existence for a year, on numerous occasions when Feedham was asked to explain how he read that, both meeting the Irish delegation, the new Irish Attorney General O'Byrne, who even Geoffrey Hand, who never had an unkind word to say about anybody in UCD, described as having an indifferent performance. But every time that Feedham met any of the delegations from Ireland or any nationalists, he made it quite clear to them the way he was reading this, that there was no provision for plebiscites, that it was open to him to make recommendations on either side, give and take, that they would effectively go about their business in a way that would leave Northern Ireland still viable, that there would be no interference with...
That Northern Ireland would have to remain the same provincial entity at the end of this process.
As it was at the start. And the economic and social thing would trump. The famous one was that the wishes of the inhabitants would be the primary, but not the paramount consideration, that it could be...
And he also at one stage maintained that there were cases where nationalists had to be saved from themselves.
Yes.
That it would be in their economic interests to remain in Northern Ireland. Yes. And Kevin O'Higgins put
That's
it like
a habit
this.
of thinking that has endured, of course.
He said, you know, Newry is the acid test.
Yeah.
Newry was, what, roughly three-quarters Catholic nationalist. It had the Bestbrook linen mill. Would it remain as a significant port? If that was of intrinsic economic importance to that area, well, then that trumped whatever the political affiliations were. The other questions that they had to face, of course, how do you ascertain the wishes of the inhabitants? Plebiscites are out, as you mentioned. And of course, you know, the belief had been, and Michael Collins, before he died, had talked about this, well, we're going to get Fermanagh and Tyrone, we're going to get South Armagh, we're going to get parts of Down, we're going to get Derry. But there was also a recognition on the part of Collins that, you know, if we have to govern those who don't want to be here, that's going to create its own particular problem. But you're right, in relation to Feedham, the judge, and working with the wording that he had in Article 12, he was also always going to interpret that in a very minimal way, because there was nothing in there, in that wording, as he would have seen it, for him to come up with radical, and even the idea of units. You mentioned different units there. You know, one of the original proposals way back from Lloyd George had been that there be a province-wide plebiscite. And that was knocked down. But then, do you deal with poor law unions? You know, do you rely on the census? The census returns from 1911. And then when he began to meet, because they do have meetings, they're in-camera meetings. And there are 55 such meetings. And there are representatives from you know, a large number of organisations. Some people boycotted, of course. You know, there was one Oma nationalist went in, and he said he came out none the wiser. Another Oma nationalist described the proceedings as all bosh, which is a great word that you don't hear anymore. But one of the things that came up in the questioning in these in-camera hearings was, what about what the treaty signatories had said about Article 12? And again, Feedham says... That
was then, now is now.
Yeah, we're not dealing with whatever gloss or interpretation those signatories those treaty signatories have put on it. So it's quite clear that this is going to be ultimately about...
The one final thing I suppose about McNeill, before we move on to why the final shambles, was that there is no evidence from the minutes that were kept of the Commission that McNeill raised objections or countered or did any forceful advocacy of his even of his own position, not to mind the position of the government at home. He seems to have been quite spectacularly passive.
And historians have also suggested that he was very lethargic in responding to what you would have thought was very urgent correspondence in relation to the Commission.
He was, and and he did that, a warning about reading history backwards as well. When he came afterwards to do that memoir of his, which is very, very unsatisfactory, and indeed even later, he more or less suggested that in a later stage in his life that he was aware of the fact that this was going to be a disappointing outcome, and that he offered himself, as it were, taking one for the team. That he effectively knew that a younger man with a reputation to lose would have been absolutely hammered by this, but he had put up with the countermanding order. He had taken everything that could be thrown at him. He could take a little bit more abuse and it wouldn't make a damn difference. Now, very, very much, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, Katrina. They went through for a year, well, they went through for several months, from essentially when they were established, but really the work was done from the late summer, from really September, October, and through where Feedham produced the ground rules, wrote the report, and suddenly then it was to be presented. There was to be a conference at which the award, not the recommendations, because they were to determine, the award was to be announced to the different governments. And I think it was the 19th of November. And then on the 7th of November, a year and a day after their first sitting down to meet, the Morning Post newspaper published a version of the draft report, the leak. And immediately there was scrambling on all sides, shouts of foul, who did it, and so on, saying it was not the real thing, it was right. But at the end of the day, that effectively scuppered it. It scuppered it. McNeill had to resign, or resigned immediately. And then when it turns out that the recriminations began, McNeill had to resign from the Free State executive. But the point, I suppose, at this stage is, how did the Irish Free State government react? There's no points going. Nobody is getting a reward for guessing how James Craig and the Ulster Unionists reacted. They hadn't. The actual report, just for the sake of getting it right, it did recommend about 180,000 acres.
180,000 acres to come
south.
The Free State.
Yeah, with about
49,000 acres
to go.
Into the north.
And 31,000 people, and 7,500 going the other way. Yeah. And the areas that were to be assigned to Northern Ireland were a slither down in East Donegal to give Derry some kind of hinterland, and also the North Monaghan. They were and an area around Pettigo as well.
And that's the political crisis.
Yes, yeah.
Not just that the prizes that they had dreamed of were not on offer. We're actually losing East Donegal. And that is a political crisis. Yes. Of significant magnitude. And it's a panic. There's a panic then within the Free State government about how to deal with this.
And how do they deal with it?
And you see, Owen McNeill did not record his dissent, but he hadn't actually, formally signed it either. These are drafts.
But the Irish Free State then effectively went and asked that the thing be buried, that it not be in discussions between.
What was interesting about this is that there are urgent meetings in London. Kevin O'Higgins and W.T. Cosgrave and others go over to London, and Kevin O'Higgins puts it very accurately and succinctly: if this report sails, our government falls.
We'll fall. Yeah.
The Free State government is not going to survive this. So that's how grave a threat it was. Now, Stanley Baldwin is the British Prime Minister now, because again, there's been changes within British politics. Andrew Bonar-Law is long gone at this stage. Baldwin is not particularly interested in getting impaled on any Ulster cross either. So he's in quite a strong position. He said, you either accept this or what's the alternative? What was the alternative? They're trying to scramble around then. Suggesting, well, that we need something from you. A suggestion that Republican prisoners might be released, which again, the overall scheme of things, given what we have been talking about, was obviously very small fry. And then you also had...
it came down to money.
What ultimately was about Article 5, of the treaty, that they would cancel Ireland's share of the public debt. They'd still be responsible for malicious
war damage. Yes, indeed. And the annuities were still locked in separately. And essentially they got
that was seen as a cleaner way to do it, in that there was something tangible in material terms. But the sense of betrayal is acute. And Cahir Healy summed it up very well when he wrote publicly to the newspapers, saying we have been sold into political servitude for all time. And what was interesting about Cahir Healy, not just that he's a Sinn Féin MP for Fermanagh and Tyrone, he was also he was imprisoned in the Argenta, which is moored in the Belfast docks as well. But he has also been corresponding with Kevin O'Higgins and members of the government, saying, is there any indication that those in this Northern Ireland who are Republican in politics, that they will be consulted in relation to these matters? And again, he's not getting any.
No.
So there's that sense of betrayal is acute. It's a crisis for the government. The report is buried. And it's not actually...
It's not published at all.
It's not published.
It doesn't actually, the report does not actually get published until Geoffrey Hand did an edition of it in the 1969.
And Feetham and Fisher are still maintaining that it should be. And they maintained that Owen McNeill had no legal basis for resigning from the Commission.
And that his resignation did not invalidate the report.
Yeah.
But as I say, they decided to bury it. There was a handshake on the financial thing. Another thing that perhaps over the long haul you'd be chewing at is the Council of Ireland went down as well.
Yes.
And the Council of Ireland is one of these things that emerges and disappears and emerges and disappears, come back with sunning there. And it's coming and going as to whether or not there's any graw for it in Dublin. And one of the reasons I think I'd like your view on this, one of the reasons that Dublin isn't particularly broken-hearted in 1925 or indeed afterwards is that any version of the Council of Ireland involves a parity between the two. And there was no question of seeing the six-county rump as it were, as being equal and entitled to equal.
And we should acknowledge that, you know, there were those who were thinking beyond the idea that there are these prizes on offer. There was this idea that there might be local option or county option, that you could have the continuance of a Belfast Parliament in a unified Ireland, but it would be subordinate to the Dublin Parliament, but that it would have reserved powers for the area that was Northern Ireland. And that was often referred to by the Irish nationalists as essential unity. Yeah. And Arthur Griffith was actually looking at that right up to the end of the treaty negotiations. Can we have essential unity where we accept that Belfast will need its own parliament? But there was also a belief, and I found a letter that W.T. Cosgrave wrote to John A. Costello, who was Taoiseach in 1950. And this is in the aftermath of the Declaration of the Republic and Britain responding by saying essentially, you know,
Northern Ireland remains as long as
there will be no change in Northern Ireland status unless its Parliament agrees. But W.T. Cosgrave wrote to Costello and said, I talked to James Craig in 1925 about unity, and he was open to the idea of unity, and that having figured out the mechanics of unity along the lines that we've been talking about, that we could both then retire. I think looking at Cosgrave's performance and what they were actually preoccupied with, much is made of how the Northern Ireland Craig administration settled into establishing a full apparatus for an Ulster state, using Ulster as a thing. And culturally as well, Diarmaid, because remember, you know, they established in 1923 the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland as an office of its own, custodial of its own records, as if it is an historic entity. The BBC arrives at the end of 1924 in Belfast. So there's an infrastructure of identity affirmation that is different, a separate sense of peoplehood, being set in train just at the time when these negotiations and there's also, in 1925, a determination in both parts of the island that they want order, they want stability.
Oh, yes.
They want a period of peace. And of course, to complicate matters further, you have a customs barrier
1923.
Since 1923 between North and South, which was actually raised at various stages during the proceedings of the boundary commissions. So there are all those factors, but it's extraordinary the way it remains relevant right up to 1998. One of the documents I found arising from the peace process is actually when Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern are trying the final push. This meeting was on the 1st of April 1998, and there were speaking notes prepared for Bertie Ahern, and he said, we cannot, Bertie says to Blair, we cannot have concrete on one side and sand on the other. Concrete in the sense that, you know, there's going to be a recognition of Northern Ireland's legitimacy and place within the Union. We can't just have the status quo with a few add-ons. And then he said, the Boundary Commission precedent has been mentioned to me so much in recent times. We're very sceptical of reviews and commissions. So, but you then have the wording.
The wording of the
in the Good Friday Agreement, which again is ambiguous. It's about if it appears likely.
The Secretary of State may. May.
If it appears likely to the Secretary of State that there is an appetite.
An appetite for unity.
He may, you know, organise a border post. So, you know, that whole question of how these particular clauses or provisions are worded and what interpretations they are open to, that remain very relevant.
Right. I'm going to call a halt, and we can. Do we have time for some questions or contributions? Grand. Okay. So if there are any contributions or questions, we've only scratched the surface of some of this, but nonetheless there should be enough to chew on for a while. Now, is there a voice at the back? Yes.
Good evening, professors. My name is Cormac McAleer. I'm from the aforementioned County Tyrone, and they better come with a very specific question this afternoon, and that's to do with the fact that there was no agreement, apparently, on where the border runs in the Lough Foyle. And why that's an important issue today is because there's plans for a gold mine up on the Sperrins, and there's a high risk, as anybody knows about gold mining, there's a very high risk of pollution, heavy metals, going from that mine right down from the headwaters of the Lough Foyle into Lochfoyle. And would you have any comment on the fact that there is, arising from the fact of no agreement on where the border is in Lochfoyle is contested, that how that can, and the fact that there is no agreement for monitoring discharges or toxic pollution. The Crown Estate claims to own it, the Dublin government claims to own it, and the British government claims it's theirs.
That's the subject of a very high-profile legal dispute, the foil fisheries.
It was one such
case where historians were being asked to adjudicate on that. Do you remember the details of that?
I don't. I know Dan Vinci was one of the main figures. Well, I can answer it straightforward. I cannot answer your question directly. I'm not familiar with the particular thing, except to say that, as we said at the beginning, the drawing of the boundaries, the imprecision of it in a whole series of, whether it was unauthorised or authorised roads, or whether it was the case of the supply of water to Belfast and a whole series of, there were disputes on who was responsible, particularly with water courses and so on, from the very outset. I cannot, and I'm sorry, I cannot answer definitively myself precisely what you've asked, but I'm saying that it's by no means surprising that there should be disputes, because so much was left imprecise, both in 1920 and afterwards. And it wasn't only in Ireland. The great historian E.H. Carr went as a junior with the British delegation after the Versailles Treaty, and he was sent out onto the streets of Paris to try and find a reliable map for many areas of southeastern Europe, which contained the areas that were being divvied out by the winners, which had multiple place names for the different languages of the different ethnic groups. And they were unable, between down in the Danube and elsewhere, to make out where it was. And the best estimates suggest, by the way, that something above 65 million were parts of ethnic minorities left on the wrong side of a border. That is to say, contiguous to the larger ethnic group to which they wished to affiliate by 1924. So, anyway, sorry, I can't help you on that particular one. I'm sorry. Is there any? Sure. Can we have a microphone over here?
Gearoid O'Tuathaigh, I can answer that question for you. A good friend of mine was principal of Moville on the banks of Lochfoyle, or on the shores of Lochfoyle, and he tried to, well, he's a very successful sailing crew in the school that he was in, and he applied for planning permission to build a new pier just on the south of the school, and he was refused because he was told by Donegal County Council that it was part of the UK. And that answers the question.
No,
Sorry, I'm not an historian, I'm just curious. Both my grandparents were from Tyrone, my parents were from Manhan, Tyrone, and always my father particularly, he would have been born 1914, so his father was a Catholic businessman outside Strabane, and he remembers consultations and talking about being involved in some of these discussion groups. And it was always the expectation that even if there was a boundary commission, that they didn't expect much to change at that point, but they expected that there would be discussions further on, it wasn't just a closed subject. It was going to be discussed again. Yet we know later in history, we went back to no discussion until the people of Northern Ireland decide. So that was always a discussion within certainly our family, extended family. I'm just wondering, was that ever your impression, that they were given that, just let this go through and in time it will be talked about? Yeah.
No, the impression is more of battening down the hatches. I mean, as one historian put it, sure, the southern governments hardly took a look over the border after 1925 until 1969. when they had to. And there are accounts of officials from the Department of External Affairs, as it was then, what became the Department of Foreign Affairs in the 1950s, making what are almost furtive visits over the border, just to remind nationalists that they haven't been completely forgotten. But nationalists, including people like Eddie McAteer, felt very aggrieved that their concerns were not being taken seriously. And they also complained bitterly that the Dáil was not prepared to contemplate representatives from Northern nationalism sitting in Parliament in the Republic. And what I found fascinating, when the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed in 1985, we have state papers now from that year. The way John Hume of the SDLP put it at the time in 1985, this is the first time, for the first time, we have been fully included in these important constitutional questions. And it really struck me. That's 60 years after the Boundary Commission debacle, of course, from their perspective, that for the first time.
Yes.
So I think that's more dominant, that sense of abandonment. And obviously that creates particular problems too for Northern nationalists about, and even like responding to the Boundary Commission by making the decision to take their seats in the Northern Ireland Parliament, knowing that if they don't do that now, because they can't rely anymore on the possibility of.
There is. I suppose there's just one little addendum to what Diarmaid said, and that is that there were differences, obviously, not only in expectation but in response. After all, there was nobody believed among the nationalists in Belfast that if Northern Ireland continued in any shape or form, that they were going to be reallocated anywhere. It's a different matter in the communities on the border where there was either a nationalist majority or where it was 50-50 or where there were expectations and where a large amount of information had been collected. And we mentioned at the very beginning the work that had been done by Kevin O'Shields, Northeastern Boundary Bureau. A huge volume of work had been done to which a lot of people had contributed. Yeah. And there were legitimate expectations that it would be taken into account or that there would be some reporting back as to why it had not been or where it had gone. Yeah. And they felt cheated and disillusioned. And the bad taste that was left, there are variations as you run from the Lagan to east of the Bann, but there's nonetheless a wide. And the last thing I would just simply say, because I'm keeping an eye on the clock, remember population movement. It's one that's very hard at this stage to be precise about. Robert Lynch suggests that the numbers who you can say were displaced, refugees, call it what you will, who moved during that period, 1920 to 1925, between 50 and 80,000 was the figure he has. But it's actually very hard to pin on that figure because a lot of the movement was part of a circulatory labour movement to Glasgow and to Liverpool, where you're talking about a circulatory labour force rather than going into exile, and you have to more or less see how long is it for. And looking at Katrina Crowe down here in the 1901 and 1911 census, we can look forward to next year, to 1926, when the 1926 census comes online. And it will be possible to look in much more minute detail at a family level on displacement and absences over that period between 1901, 11 and 26. And almost at a familial level as well as at a neighbourhood level, it will allow micro-studies of movement during this convulsive period to be looked at much more closely. I would imagine so. Anyway.
You can't ignore the emotion around it either. And, you know, some historians have looked at press coverage and media coverage around the time of the expectation that we're talking about in advance of the Boundary Commission report. And there's a lot of focus on the idea that the island is and should be indivisible. You know, that the Almighty made it an indivisible unit and then circled it with surrounding sea, lest anyone was in doubt. And there's a very strong feeling. And the word organic is used too, you know, that this is an organic entity. It's not for mere mortals to be butchering it. So, you know, that stuff is very emotive, it's very strong, but it means something very real. And there is, I suppose, a sense that there are certain mental maps that predate all this controversy. You know, Charles Townsend, the historian, writes quite amusingly about Tim Healy, who was a Wexford nationalist MP, who agreed to stand for election in Monaghan in 1883. And the way he described it was the remote north, you know, up to Monaghan. And then there was a description of that as the kind of the invasion of Ulster, which underlines, I suppose, some of the fears that it was generating. But the way Townsend put it, that spoke volumes about the view from Dublin. And there was an Ulster representative on the Sinn Féin executive in 1919, and the way he put it was, don't desert your Highlanders. And the response of another southern member of the Sinn Féin executive was that, you know, the Republicans in Fermanagh and Tyrone, they may be a Republican in politics, but they're northern in character.
Oh, yeah.
And again, that is really revealing.
It is.
You know, again, prior to this episode, about the perception that they're different, even if they're politically aligned with us.
I'd be very careful about that now, Diarmaid, because if you look at it, there are people in parts of West Cork that say that there was a mixed marriage because somebody married somebody from Killarney. Do you know what I mean? Basically, if you're looking at it also, that cabinet, even the cabinet the cabinet that was in place when Noel MacNeill resigned. Yeah. I mean, MacNeill was in the Glens of Antrim. Yeah. Ernest Blythe was in that cabinet. Right. When MacNeill went, Paddy McGilligan came in from Coleraine. Yeah. If you look at the people who were on the northeastern boundary, Kevin O'Sheil, McCartney from County Down, who was the director of publicity. Yeah. And when you look at the European aspect of it, there was nobody on the unionist side had the command of ethnic minorities and their rights that Burton Waller had, who had written a book on it after the Versailles thing. So the character one is one that's reverted to, and the use that vocabulary of exclusion, Ulster folk.
It comes up during the treaty negotiations. I mean, this is why Tom Jones' diaries are so illuminating, you know, where Arthur Gifford is describing or David Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, is describing the pugnacious Ulster people. And Arthur Griffith is talking about how obdurate and stubborn they are. But he also says, because this comes up as well, he says there are two ways to annoy a working class unionist. Number one is to speak respectfully of the Pope, and number two is to call him an Englishman. Yeah. So, I mean, they don't trust London either, you know, and we have to remember that.
But we're going to wrap it up soon, Katrina, is that okay? All right, but just on that score, I mean, you can have contradictory stereotypes depending on what argument you're making. Many of the nationalists, and indeed outside in London, it was a view among some that the Northern were so hard-headed about business that once the economic case for such and such a thing was made convincingly, that was it. And they were able to find businessmen in the North when they went north to give them that kind of an impression. But if you actually look at the elemental identity issue, that doesn't survive any scrutiny at all about the more elemental and emotional thing any more than it would with Irish nationalism. I mean, you're not talking about hard-headed Scottish businessmen.
The one thing, of course, that's missing from the Irish delegation that negotiated the treaty is an Ulster negotiation. Now, did that have a meaningful impact on what became Article 12, you know? Would there have been more sensitivity?
Owen MacNeill is the problem, isn't he? I mean, he is supposed to be... And I don't know about you, but Owen MacNeill's The North Began article that for the volunteers raises the same dilemma. What did he think he was recommending when it came around to it? What did Roger Casement, who was from the same neck of the woods, what did he think he was recommending? They were supposed to know their fellow Northerners and so on and so forth. When you look at what they're recommending, they're not taking anything. Look, we could have another afternoon on this. Could I thank Diarmaid for his compendious and articulate way of presenting history to all audiences. Well done. Well done.